And it is my honor to welcome you to Moving America Forward, the first ever presidential candidate forum on infrastructure. United for Infrastructure is a nonpartisan, nonprofit infrastructure, education, and advocacy organization, and it has been our honor for many years to convene and collaborate with leaders from American labor, business, and government on this important issue. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to say thank you. First, thank you to the City of Las Vegas and the great state of Nevada for hosting us. I'd like to recognize a few local leaders from the community who are with us today: Congressman Stephen Horsford, Henderson, Nevada Mayor Deborah March, North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee, Ely, Nevada Mayor Nathan Robertson, Las Vegas City Councilman Brian Knudsen, and all the way from Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti. I'd very much like to thank our host committee, the organizations who with us created this, the vision for this event, provided resources to make it a reality, invited the candidates, and have brought hundreds of their members to Nevada and to be here in the room with us today. You can see their logos up on the banner behind me. Those organizations are in no particular order: the International Union of Operating Engineers, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Value of Water Campaign, the American Council of Engineering Companies, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, Transport Workers Union of America, the American Public Transportation Association, Transportation Trades Department, AFL-CIO, the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, Airports Council International North America, Build Together, and North America's Building Trades Unions. Thank you. Give them a round of applause. I'd like to thank our sponsors whose generosity has made this event possible: our presenting sponsor, HNTB, and our forum sponsors, Autodesk, Parsons, Vulcan Materials Company, and WSP USA. Thank you very much. I'd like to share a special thanks to the Wall Street Journal for being our media partner, and to Jerry Seib and Gene Cummings, who I'll welcome out to the stage in a moment, for moderating today's conversation, and for the immense amount of work that they have put into preparing for this event. To the press covering this event, and to all of our viewers tuning in on C-SPAN and on live stream, thank you for joining us today and for your passion on this issue. And if you're following in the audience or online, please join us in our conversation on social media at #MovingAmericaForward. Last, I'd like to thank our candidates themselves for joining us today and for treating this issue with the seriousness it deserves. Infrastructure is everything. It's how we experience our daily lives, for better and for worse. The quality of our infrastructure determines the length of our commutes, how much time we spend with our families, if our trucks and trains and planes make it to their destinations on time. It's the quality of the water coming out of our taps and the health of our environment. It's our ability to live in affordable homes and get to jobs, to our doctors, to our schools, to age in place, reliably, affordably, and safely. It's a prerequisite for manufacturers, retailers, and farmers getting their goods to market at home and around the globe. It's the dams and levees designed to protect us from flooding, from drought, from uncertainty. And for more than 17 million Americans, it's our career: operating our water systems, driving and maintaining our buses and trains, repairing our roads that we built in the last century, and designing and building bridges and airports and seaports for the more resilient and secure future. Yet this foundation of our lives, our communities, and our economy is too often failing us. Too many of our policies are outdated, our investments insufficient, our priorities unclear. And Americans are already paying the price in dollars, in missed opportunity, and in lives. American voters are asking for their leaders to act on this issue. Nearly 90% of swing state voters believe that the president and Congress should make infrastructure a top priority. That is why we, led by our host committee, felt that we could not let this election cycle slip by without inviting the leading candidates for President of the United States, including President Trump, to articulate their visions and plans for building a better America by renewing our infrastructure. 4 of those candidates have accepted our invitation and will be joining us on this stage today. Vice President Biden, Senator Klobuchar, Mayor Buttigieg, and Tom Steyer. Please give them all a round of applause. Now it's my honor to kick off our program and introduce our moderators. Please join me in a warm welcome for Jerry Seib, Executive Editor, Washington Editor of the Wall Street Journal, and Gene Cummings, Deputy Chief of the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Thank you all for being here. Gene and I want to extend the Wall Street Journal's thank you as well. And to say that, this is an important topic. Infrastructure needs attention in this country, and therefore it deserves attention as a campaign issue, and we're going to try to give it that today. A few data points just to illustrate that. 1 in every 5 miles of roadway in this country that qualifies for federal aid is in poor condition. 235,000 bridges need structural repair, rehabilitation, or replacement. That's 4 in every 10. Here's my favorite one. 47,000 bridges are classified as structurally deficient in this country, and if you place those bridges end to end, they would stretch from Chicago to Houston. And this is a problem not just for the federal government, it's also a problem for state governments. Data from the Pew Charitable Trust show that state spending on infrastructure dropped almost every year between 2009 and 2018. And in fact, 2018 marked the lowest level of state infrastructure spending as share of the economy in 35 years. So that's why we're here today.
So thank you. Echo Zach. Thank you all for participating and coming here. And thank you to C-SPAN for sharing this with a broader audience. It is a terribly important subject for us to discuss. Now, our format today is that we'll have about 25 minutes with each of the candidates. Jerry and I will field a few questions with them, and then we will take questions that have been submitted by members, rank-and-file members of the coalition that is joined to put on this great event, and also Wall Street Journal subscribers. So we thank all the people who have participated, and we think we have a pretty interesting discussion and very questions that we can bring today. And with that, we'd like to start with Vice President Joe Biden.
Thanks again. Thanks again.
You bet.
Can you hear it? Hello, Mr. Mayor.
Guess they like you.
Election?
I said, I guess they like you.
Oh, I thought you said there's an election coming up.
Oh, no, there's no election. You were misinformed.
They know I like infrastructure.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate
Thanks for having me, Jerry.
Let's start at the 10,000-foot level, so to speak. As we were just discussing, America's infrastructure needs work. The roads, the bridges, the highways of America, the airports, the water systems, they all need work.
Across the board.
And with a $1 trillion deficit, it's hard to know where to start. But at the same time, every Democratic candidate also thinks that it's important that the country move away from a fossil fuel energy and transportation system to a more green, climate-friendly system. So the question is, if you've got to set priorities, where do you start? Do you start with fixing the old infrastructure, or do you start with moving on to a new climate-friendly green infrastructure in this country?
Jerry, I think it's a false choice. I think you do both. I think you start off with fixing the broken infrastructure in a modern way. For example, every one of those bridges we're talking about, we're going to spend billions more over time as these collapse, cause trouble. You see people losing their lives. But also, we can modernize them in a considerable way in terms of making them energy efficient. We can make sure, for example, that what I want to do for all the existing highways have to be repaired in addition to new ones, put in literally 500,000 new charging stations in the 2020s. And we can do that. It's not like it's, you know, when I say that to people, I know this is an infrastructure crowd, you all get it. But I say that to ordinary people out there, and they go, well, wait a minute, charging stations. I say, you ever go in a big city and watch all those scooters going around? They just plug in. Well, there's a lot we can do that can create good jobs that are labor jobs that are paying 50, 60 bucks an hour, and still at the same time both increase the efficiency of all the infrastructure as well as making it green. There's a lot more examples. I know I only have a little bit of time, so why don't I stop there?
Well, I guess that raises the second most important question, and that is, how do you pay for it? With
I
the
agree.
gas tax stalled as it is, how do you pay for it?
Well, we're so far behind the eight ball. One of the things you may remember, we had a thing called the Recovery Act, $900 billion the president put me in charge of, and he'd love to do a State of the Union and saying, Joe's going to. He'd never tell me ahead of time. You know, Sheriff Joe's going to take care of this. Well, Sheriff Joe got to spend $90 billion in infrastructure out of that package, and we did a great deal of work. But what we did was we provided a number of programs that, in fact, were, for every dollar we spent, we brought $4 off the sidelines in private dollars, state dollars. Because, you know, I heard you speaking in the beginning here when I was standing back there that what you have is, you know, it's not infrastructure. Is not a Republican or Democrat thing. It used to be, Republicans used to like infrastructure. They used to actually build it, you know? Everyone from Erie Canal on, but at any rate. And what happens is that if you want to grow American business and enterprise, you've got to have the most modern ports, you got to have the most modern airports, you got to have the most modern locks and dams. You got to be able to get product from your factory to the customer quickly. And so there's overwhelming incentive, and there's a desire in the local areas as well as among businesses to want to invest if they know the federal government's in. And the way I start off with is, and I come from the corporate state of America. You've heard of it, DuPont, you know, Delaware. It used to be the 8th largest corporation in the world, no longer is. But the point is that we reduced the corporate tax to 21%. I raised it back to 28%. I think we can get some Republicans to support that as well. That raises $740 billion over 10 years. I have a $1.3 trillion infrastructure plan that breaks out in a whole bunch of ways we can talk about, but that's number one. Number two, there are a number of corporations that are not paying any tax at all. So there should be a minimum 15% when they report earnings to Wall Street to keep their stock up. Well, whatever that number is they report, they got to pay 15% of that, no matter what exemptions they have. Now, if they, in fact, are paying at 21% corporate tax rate across the board, they don't have to pay that. But a minimum of 15%, well, that's another $420 billion. Again, one of the things that's happened, I know you're all kind of looking at me like, how Biden going to make that happen? Well, I'm pretty good at getting those kinds of things happening in the Congress, but here's the reason. The reason is Republicans out there, Republican voters are going, hey, wait a minute, man. You had this $1.9 trillion tax cut. It didn't help me a whole hell of a lot if I'm not in the top couple percent. Middle class is getting killed. A lot of those folks are middle class or Republicans or middle class conservative on social values and the rest. But I believe the Band-Aid's kind of been ripped off here. And people are ready to do rational things.
Does that include the gas tax?
Well, I don't think we have to do that. I think we got to put in $50 billion off the bat on the gas tax coming from those additional taxes. But I don't think I've tried this before. We're not going to be able to raise the gas tax. We may be able to index it down the line, but I don't think we're going to be able to raise the gas tax from what it is now to what it would be if we had been raised for inflation. But it would allow you to do all you had to do in the first $50 billion you could do to invest in modernizing those highways, not counting building new ones. And one part we haven't talked about at all is that I think the biggest sector, and I don't want to get him in trouble, Mayor Garcetti, he can tell you that, in fact, more energy, time, and wages are lost sitting on an LA freeway, and you can go beyond the LA freeway, you can go to Chicago, go to a lot of places. And if we're able to use the technology that is on the cusp of being able to have, first of all, more transit, more transit. We're in a position where, for example, when I was asked to bail out Detroit, put Detroit together, but I was. I mean, that was one of the jobs I was given. I was able to pick from any part of the government. What we found out was that 60% of the people lived in the city. Their jobs were out of town, but they didn't have automobiles. So we put in light rail. It modernized and it made a fundamental change in the economic growth in that area. And it didn't add more automobiles to the highways, number one. Number two, if we take a look at what the president allowed me to do when we did the first part of the Recovery Act, we came up with I'm a big rail guy, okay, and high-speed rail. If we just took the 3 corridors that we had already appropriated the money for, including New York from New Jersey through the tunnels, hadn't been modernized since 1916, all the way from Orlando to Tampa, all the way from Tallahassee all the way across into Mississippi. These are high-speed rail areas where you all know, and again, I know there's a lot of transportation people out there. You'll get people out of their car into a train or into another method if, in fact, you can guarantee them they can get there in the same amount of time with the same amount of reliability. We can do that. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to build in those corridors we've identified, including Chicago and up that way, that it can go 220 miles an hour. If you just state that, we can't do this now, but if you state out 3 curves and from Washington to New York, you could reduce the travel time, and I've traveled over 2,100,000 miles on Amtrak. That's the God's truth. That's what at least the guys on the rail tell me. If you straighten out those 3 curves, which would be a lot now because you're going to have a lot of eminent domain, you'd have real problems. But if you're able to straighten out those 3 curves, you could get there in an hour and a half. Fundamentally changing. Every single lane of highway on I-95, Jerry, 1 lane, $20 million. Do the same thing on railroad, you're talking about $4 million.
But let me ask you, you mentioned Republicans and there should be some bipartisan support for doing the kinds of things you're talking about. One of the things Republicans say, and a Republican in particular named Donald J. Trump says, is that one of the reasons these things
You're not a Republican.
Okay.
You can laugh. A lot of you are Republicans. You know he's not the Republican Party. This ain't your father's Republican Party.
Yeah, that's true. So one of the things Republicans generically say is that one of the reasons these things don't happen is the regulations slow them down. They slow down infrastructure. They make them more expensive, particularly environmental regulations. And the Trump administration has tried to do something about that. Are they right?
They're right, but they got the wrong answer. Look what we did in the Triborough Bridge. Look what we did in we fundamentally eliminated and streamlined the ability to get through all of the regulatory requirements that were necessary. You see what's happening in the New York airport at LaGuardia. So absolutely, we can in fact streamline significantly without damaging the environment. It's a matter of, I'll give you a concrete example. When the president asked me to deal with anyway, I was asked to put together a cabinet initiative, and it was on health care. And I turned to one of the major cabinet holders and I said, when will you have your assistant? This was on February the 7th. And they said, well, we'll have one by the end of the year. I said, I'll tell you what, if you don't have one by March the 1st, you're fired. He said, you can't fire me. I said, go talk to the president. Guess what? We had one in a week and a half. It's not, no, I'm not being facetious now. I give my word, I'm not kidding. A lot of it has to do with the knowledge that not you have to find some new answer, is you have to make a priority to invest in that piece, whatever that piece is. And we can significantly streamline regulations without doing everything from endangering the Endangered Species Act all the way straight through to generating more pollution. And we've done that a number of places. And I would have somebody in the White House had one job at all, just one. I mean it sincerely, doing nothing but streamlining projects. But do it within the context of having people who, in fact, know what they're talking about in terms of the environment. Most of it is just bureaucratic delay.
You mentioned setting priorities.
Yep.
And we've talked about new trains
Yep.
and, new projects that can be built faster if we streamline regulations. And yet, most jobs in infrastructure are in maintenance. And what a lot of people talk about are the crumbling infrastructure of America. So how do you prioritize that? Do you fix the crumbling part, or do you just build all the shiny new parts?
Well, you have to do both. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's neither or a choice, for example. For example, if you're talking about our ports, you have to build ports that are ready to handle these Panamax ships that are now available, okay? But it didn't mean you don't have to go back and restore the docks. At the same time, you're increasing the size, scope, and the capability and the cranes that take them off the docks. You need both. You have to go out and dredge, which you always had to do, which we're way behind on and haven't done. You've been able to find spoil areas to provide for the spoils, but that's old stuff. But the new stuff is the new kind of cranes, the speed with which it happens, access from the highway, the interstate highway, to the port. We did that in South Carolina. I helped do that down in Savannah. We're doing that in Florida. So I don't see them as either or. And the maintenance piece is we have to maintain not only what we have to bring up to snuff what is out there that's haven't been maintained, but the new initiatives are going to be much more capable of sustaining longevity without this kind of intensive maintenance that has been needed in the past. It's called technology. And I'm not being a wise guy when I say that. I didn't mean that as a disrespectful way. But the new technologies are capable of being able to do so much more. For example, there's no reason why at our ports we don't have solar capacity to be able to make sure that we save a whole hell of a lot of energy, create a lot of new jobs for people out there, just like here in California, here in Nevada. Go out to Techno Valley. They're building a 600 megawatt capacity out there. We should be investing in how you transfer that capacity from here to the Midwest and to the other parts of the country. We've not invested the time, energy, or money into deciding how you transmit clean energy, whether it's wind or solar. So I've honestly, God, I've not seen that dichotomy. For example, last example, water. Water's a big problem. There's a lot of potable water that's in real trouble. Well, we have to dig up those old wooden pipes, that's true. But the new pipes we put in, the new mechanisms we're able to put in, should be much more resilient. We have half the pipes in the ground are there for over 40, 50 years already. And so you can't say, I'm going to just go new without dealing with what's there, in my view.
So before we run out of time, we want to ask some questions that were sent to us by readers and by members of the coalition that's sponsoring here. And one of these questions touches on a subject that hasn't come up yet, which is airports. Richard from Las Vegas asks this. He says, here in Las Vegas, the County Department of Aviation is developing a new second airport to serve growing southern Nevada. House Democrats released an infrastructure framework which for the first time in 20 years increases the airport passenger facility charge and indexes it to inflation to help remedy airport overcrowding in terminals and increasing delays on runways. As president, would you sign a bill to increase the passenger facility charge to modernize airport infrastructure, charge passengers more?
Yes, I would. What it is, it's about 5.4, I think it's about 5.4% now. Yes, I would. But the second piece of this, Jerry, is that one of the things that's going to happen is, let me give you an example. On the East Coast, every single solitary airport from Maine to Florida that is within 50 miles of the water actually has fewer people getting on and off an aircraft than are on Amtrak every day in that corridor. Let's just get some things straight. So the idea, and we continue to subsidize, for example, the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, an airport in Bemidji, Minnesota. Well, maybe you have to help that. But a lot can change, Jerry, if we look at the transportation net in a way that's different than we've looked at it before. And the way to deal with it seems to me, is not just decide we're going to continue the same pattern of distribution and modernize it and make it real, but you're going to change the way in which regional airports work. For example, in Philadelphia, a big airport, Wilmington, Delaware has a large airport that is mostly private. And what happens is that's where you, not because of me, but that's where Air Force One practices and landings and takeoffs. I always thought that was a good omen. But really, all kidding aside, it has all the capacity. So what we should be doing is figuring out the way in which we deal with routes. Why do we have the routes we have now into our major airports that are so overcrowded? Well, because not over my house. Not over my house. I get that. So you'll be able to redirect, and it's beyond my pay grade to know exactly how to do it, but we should be able to integrate regional airports that are already there, small airports that are already there, among the big regional airports to deal with part of the capacity and the overload. But I would, in fact, sign a bill that raised that tax.
So Jim D. from Knoxville has a question that has to do with what really becomes the friction between your Democrats' desire to bring green jobs and green agendas to the table, but still maintain in many ways the old infrastructure that feeds fossil fuels. So his question is, would you consider national tolls as a possibility to reduce congestion and pay for some of the maintenance, or a congestion tax or anything like that to try to get some cars off the roads?
Is it Jim?
Yes.
Jim, look, I don't see them as, you have to change the transportation structure, the network, the structure. If you have people, if you had running through every major city and a commuter line that was in the middle of the 4-lane highways going in and out of those cities, you could radically reduce the number of people that are on that highway. You would save billions of dollars in lost wages. You'd save billions of gallons of gasoline over time. But so this suggests that what we have to do is keep the exact same system network as we have it. I wish we had a great big board up here that we could actually draw on the board the means by which you get from point A to point B. That's got to change. It's going to change, and it has to change. But when it changes, what I found when I did the Recovery Act was we got, for example, we had great problems in South Carolina. That, didn't want to, they had problems with the port and maintaining the port. Well, guess what? Turns out a significant portion of the things that get shipped out of that port get shipped to them from the Midwest on railroads. But the railroad system was backwards, was not working very well. So we took money and we invested in that, as well as the Port of Baltimore. Kept an awful lot of factories in Ohio open because we get from the product from the factory to the port by doing some imaginative stuff, taking and reconnecting railroad systems that used to exist but have fallen apart. They've fallen apart, particularly in freight rail. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think we keep thinking of this, and how do you maintain the old structure? Well, we're ranked, what, 28th, 29th in Society of Engineers. I met with a while ago. I think we're 28th or 29th most modern infrastructure in the world, the United States of America. 28 or 29? You're going to open up a new factory. You're going to open up in Hong Kong, or you're going to open up in Baltimore. You open in San Francisco, you're going to open up in, another place that invested billions of dollars in getting from factory to ship and out. And so I just think we have to think of it in a different way. And it doesn't mean you ignore the past. It doesn't mean you walk away from it. But it means you, instead of investing billions of dollars in things that no longer are viewed as the best way to get from point A to point B, whether it's you or product, you can do it, and when you rebuild it, you can build it so it is greener. There's no rationale to build any new infrastructure project that isn't green. For example, of the $1.3 trillion, the $1.3 billion that I call for over 10 years in my infrastructure plan, $100 billion of it goes into making sure that, $100 million modernizing our schools. How many of you live in school districts you're worried your kid's going to drink the water out of the fountain? Or there's still asbestos in the air? No, I'm serious. I'm deadly earnest. Or we've taken away tax credits so the wind comes blowing through the windows. You're using so much more energy than you need to use. It makes sense. We can save a lot of money. We can create 6 million new union jobs. And by the way, I want to make it clear, so for you Republicans out there, every single thing in my administration that's infrastructure job is going to be Davis-Bacon. It's going to be everyone. I really mean it. Because guess what that does? That generates economic growth within communities. They invest, they build, they stay, they build better homes, they go out and they do invest more money. And that's, we had a big fight in that $90 billion, Jerry, that I was in charge of, making sure we got it out. I insisted every single dollar had to be Davis-Bacon. And so, but the point, I'm not trying to be good or, but I think we think too small. I think we think in terms of when you spend money, you increase salaries, you provide good paying jobs that pay 50, 60 bucks an hour plus benefits, that somehow that hurts everybody. The wealthy get wealthier. The middle class is able to sustain itself and the poor have a way up. That's what it's about. And it's never not been that way. No one's ever shown me a model to suggest that when you have hard-working people, and the way I say it to make a point, if all of a sudden every iron worker in America went on strike, or you had a choice, every iron worker goes on strike, or every IBW member goes on strike, quits for 6 months, or every Wall Street banker quits. I'm not being facetious. Think about it. It will come to a screeching halt. Screeching halt. We should pay these people. And by the way, business trying to take over apprenticeship programs, not on my watch. Probably gave you more than you wanted to hear or less than you needed. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. No, you got us off to a great start, and we appreciate it. Your passion for this subject is really appreciated, and I can't get those millions of miles on Amtrak out of my head now. So anyway.
By the way, they told me when I got elected, there was an accident in my family. I lost family. I started to go home every night, thinking I was only going to stay for 6 months. Well, I've made, they tell me, over 250 miles a day. I've made thousands and thousands of round trips to get home. So that's the only reason it went up. And I got criticized for them naming a train station after me in Delaware. They should name the whole damn line after me, man, I tell you. Anyway, thank you all
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So I think we are ready for round two. Yes? Oh, not quite. Anyway, so the problem with Vice President Biden is just bringing him out of his shell, I think.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift.
Makes your job as an interviewer very easy. I just want to say that. So, anyway, again, thank you all for being here. Thanks to the C-SPAN audience. We're now going to move on to candidate number two. It's, by luck of the draw, is Tom Steyer, who I think is here and ready to join us on stage. Yes, Mr. Steyer. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So we're trying to suss out with all of the candidates the balance that they try to seek when they look ahead at what their infrastructure priorities and agenda would be. I mean, you become president, we have water problems, we have road problems, we have all sorts of airport problems, we have problems with everything that's buried under the ground for the last 50 years and everything that goes across water. So you have limited funds. How do you balance it? What are your priorities? Where would you put the limited resources that you have into your projects?
So let me say this. There are different ways to do infrastructure in this world. And One of the ways is to raise tax money and spend it, and I think that that's an important way to do it, and we're going to talk about that. On the first day of my presidency, I would declare a climate emergency and start changing the rules under which private corporations are allowed to generate energy, about the kinds of cars they're allowed to produce, and the kinds of building efficiency rules they have to operate under. Those are also infrastructure projects. They just don't come under the budget of the United States government. And so I think on day one, I would declare a climate emergency, and we would order those rules, and we would prioritize them based on the impact they'd have on dealing with our climate crisis. And so those are not ones that would hit the budget of the United States or take congressional approval in order to have it happen. But starting on day one, we would move the country forward in terms of spending hundreds of billions of dollars through the private sector to ensure that we start moving on our climate crisis, and we send a message to the people in the country and the rest of the world that this is our top priority and we're going to get it done.
So would you move federal money away from traditional infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, potholes, to green energy, A? And B, do you think the federal government should subsidize the production of electric cars to move the country toward the green environment you want to see?
So let me say this. Everything that we're going to do, we're going to view from the standpoint of climate. But there's a series, we have an infrastructure backlog, including roads and bridges, that is really cutting into our efficiency as a country and our, making rural America putting it at a huge disadvantage. But we also have a gigantic housing problem in the sense that we probably have 7 million too few affordable housing units in this country. That is also got to be solved from the standpoint of the federal government and from the standpoint of climate. That when we build 7 million new units, they're going to have to be done in a climate smart way. So in answer to your question, Jerry, really, there's no way to distinguish between the needs of the people and the needs of the climate, because we have to deal with the needs of the people real time, but we have to do it in a smart way.
And would you, on the electric vehicles front, would you use government resources to further the use of electric vehicles by subsidizing their production or their purchase?
Well, what we've seen is that over time, the cost of electric vehicles is coming down, and it has to reach a point where it's comparable to, internal combustion cars. And so the question is going to be, how long does it take for that to happen, and what do we have to do in order to make it price competitive for American consumers? I don't think we're going to have to do that. I believe that, in fact, the ingenuity of Americans is going to get us to electric cars that are cheaper than internal combustion cars and are going to be safe when you take everything into account. So what I really think is going to happen is we're going to have to push for that to happen faster. And if we have to subsidize things in the short run in order to get the good answer, I think actually the way that we'll be spending money on this is most likely to be to help families with cash for clunkers. I think that it's much more likely that the government ends up buying back polluting vehicles so people can go and buy cleaner vehicles without loss than it is that we're going to actually subsidize production.
As much as you've made climate clearly the top priority here, the big projects that have been proposed in the past face great opposition from locals. We have the wind farm off Cape Cod, 16 years in the making, still not done. Eminent domain remains an option for the federal government that's enormously unpopular. So how do you manage that tension? Should the federal government have more say in land use issues? How would you balance the desires of a local community to remain unchanged and a priority of the federal government to change the country?
Well, let me say this. To the extent that we have a crisis, then the federal government's going to have to exercise its authority. But actually, when you look at eminent domain, the examples that I've seen have mostly to do with pipelines. That the real eminent domain question has been, how are we going to build the Keystone Pipeline across a bunch of farms in Nebraska? What are we going to do with the Dakota Access Pipeline? In fact, what we're talking about to a very large extent in terms of clean energy is concentrated economic activities in close-built places, public transportation, building upgrades. It's actually the kind of, you're right about the offshore windmills that people have fought from the standpoint of the views from their houses. But by and large, what we've really seen is that clean energy is not something that has had a huge pushback in terms of eminent domain, and I don't expect that it will. What we're really talking about is rebuilding America in a more concentrated fashion, pushing things together and trying to make sure that we have as much clean transportation, as much public transportation, and as concentrated housing as possible. The real big numbers here, and I'm sitting here looking at them, have to do with building upgrades, roads and bridges, clean transportation, and housing.
So a lot of the federal government's spending on infrastructure is financed through the gas tax, which replenishes the highway fund. It's been stagnant for a quarter of a century, the level of the gas tax. People argue for raising the gas tax for two reasons. One is it helps replenish the highway trust fund, pays for the infrastructure. And second, some would argue, it discourages continued use of fossil fuels. With those things in mind, would you raise the federal gas tax?
Look, I think what we've seen in California is that's a super politically sensitive thing. What we are definitely going to have to do is raise taxes. And the question is it going to be on consumers? Is it going to be on businesses? If you look at my actual plan, I have a plan to roll back the giveaways to big corporations and rich people. I have a plan for a wealth tax. I should tell people from the Wall Street Journal that I have a plan to treat investment income on the exact same schedule for people that I treat earned income. If you do that, you get trillions of dollars. So in fact, my goal in this is not to do a regressive consumer tax, exact opposite. We have a regressive tax system right now. My goal is actually to have a much more progressive tax, to undo the tax giveaways of the last 40 years, to actually tax wealth in a different way, because we've actually concentrated wealth in an unacceptable fashion in our society. My goal, look, my goal in this is to raise wages, have more money come in a much more progressive fashion, and rebuild America in a way that everybody knows we have to do it, and we can easily afford to do it. We just have to get over the idea that rich people don't pay taxes anymore.
Well, testing the limits of your green agenda, would you consider imposing fuel standards, renewable fuel standards on commercial airplanes? And would you, right now the Pentagon is really the only agency that's doing big R&D, because obviously the needs that they have, all of their planes. Would you invest more money into the Pentagon program in order to get to a point where you could impose such standards?
So that's actually a great question. I'll tell you why. Not that you haven't figured it out. It's a great question, because in most of the areas of energy, we can see technologies that are either already cheaper than fossil fuel technologies, or you can look at a decline curve where they're going to be cheaper. So you can look at solar and wind and say it's cheaper than fossil fuel energy. You can look at electric cars and say, realistically, these can be cheaper. This is not going to be penalizing consumers. We're on a decline curve where you can see that they'll be more than competitive. The place where it's not true, which is why I'm complimenting you on the question, is on airplanes, because we haven't really seen any kind of technological breakthrough that will really change this. So the question is, how are we actually going to deal with a large source of greenhouse gases, which is air traffic, in a way that we don't destroy it, but also charge people fairly and push towards clean? So the easiest thing to say here, which you brought up, which fairly, is that we'll spend a bunch of money on research and development to try and come up with a substitute for, gasoline. And that's easy to say. The Pentagon is doing it, and we should push as hard on biofuels and whatever we can come up with as possible. The real question will be, if that doesn't work or we can't see it working fast enough, how do we respond to that? Is that by charging people for the cost of their pollution and therefore putting a tax on the gasoline itself, or what do we actually do? I think that's probably the easiest, simplest thing to do, is to charge people for the pollution that they're creating. But it would be a hell of a lot better if, in fact, we spend a bunch of money on coming up with alternatives so we don't have to cut down on them. on the actual, activity itself.
So the transition to electric vehicles that you talk about requires a national network of recharging stations.
Yes.
Is the construction of such a network the job of the government, or is that the role of a private sector?
Well, the question is going to be how it gets charged for. Because, the truth is gas stations are quite lucrative businesses where people basically charge and, make money for every gallon of gasoline and then sell you a bunch of sandwiches and Coca-Cola. The question is going to be, does that kind of activity work once you have electric vehicles? How long does it take to actually charge your vehicle? And how practical it is. How do people end up doing it? So to the extent it's like a gasoline station, then it's going to be private. To the extent that it isn't, and we end up with a different form of charging, like at home or at business, at a place where it's going to be much more hard, then in fact the government's going to end up having to spend a bunch of money on it.
Well, to follow on that, if the government invests all that money into creating this charging system, then to protect that infrastructure, do you not have cyber worries? What would you have to do to make sure someone didn't hack that system and bring the country to a screeching halt?
Well, to be fair, that exists right now. If you're saying that basically having a series of electric charging stations makes us vulnerable to somebody hacking the electricity system so you can no longer charge your vehicles, that's true of our electricity system right now. And, and we saw what happened, I think it was in Ohio, when a tree fell against an electric line and wiped out like 3 states' electricity for a couple days. We're very subject to that. I think as we get more technologically advanced, we get more dependent on the technology, and the ability to hack it goes up, no question about it.
Some people think that forests and floodplains and natural habitats should be considered infrastructure. They're just green infrastructure. I think California classifies watersheds as infrastructure components. So would you spend traditional infrastructure dollars on Green New Deal projects like that and on green infrastructure?
Look, I don't think there's any question that that is infrastructure. That, if you look around this country, wetlands and watersheds and parks are infrastructure that is necessary for a healthy country. And if you look at what it takes to have clean water and to have safe, coastal areas, that we're going to have to protect those. And you can call it whatever you want, but it's an investment in a functioning and safe America. Look, I think that we have obviously failed on infrastructure as a country. We have not spent the money to keep up our roads and bridges or to move into the new things we need to do. And we're hundreds of billions of dollars behind in roads and bridges. Our estimate is 450, but my point is this. The good news is we need to do it smarter. We have to do it on an accelerated basis. It is going to be the biggest building project in American history, which means we're going to create millions and millions of good-paying union jobs. And so, as opposed to feeling like, oh, isn't it too bad that we're behind? Actually, now we can do it smarter than ever. Now we can use it to build the kind of country we want to have, and we can use it to revive. We can have, our estimate is the highest percentage of union participation in the labor force since 1945. Wouldn't that be awesome?
So we're going to switch now to some questions that were submitted by members of the various coalitions that put this great event together and Wall Street Journal readers.
Great.
So this question comes from John here in Las Vegas. And he points out that 40 million Americans, including 2 million here in southern Nevada, rely upon the Colorado River, Lake Mead, and other reservoirs for their daily water supplies. What would you direct your Secretary of Interior to do to address the threats presented by drought and climate change in the Colorado River Basin and across Western U.S.?
So, water in the Western United States, you don't get any more emotional than water fights. And the Colorado River is the center of those fights. So part of this is going to be an extreme need on our part to collect water more carefully, to use water more carefully, and to reuse water more efficiently. And we can see that actually this is very possible. That we have very primitive water supplies in a lot of ways. And in fact, what we're seeing in places that are very short of water, including Los Angeles, is that our ability to capture rainwater is much higher than we understand, and our ability to reuse water and new water treatment facilities is much better than we understand. So whereas the climate crisis absolutely is putting a huge amount of pressure on water and drought, and specifically on the Colorado River, what we also know is that our capabilities and technology on water are far better than people understand, and we're actually going to be able to solve this problem. That it's true. We should understand Americans are smart. We are going to be able to adapt to this, and I can see it when I travel around the southwest of the United States, where really people think Los Angeles could be water independent. That's an amazing fact. That's where we are.
So Ghassan of New Orleans asks an interesting question that actually ties together several of the things we've been talking about here. He writes that 15 years ago, Hurricane Katrina slammed into my city of New Orleans. About 80% of the city was underwater. 1,800 lives were lost. We know that extreme weather events are going to happen more and more, and older coastal cities like ours are especially vulnerable. How will your plan help coastal cities improve their resilience to climate change? And I would just add as a footnote, are you prepared to tell people who live in the heartland of the country that they're going to have to help pay for climate change remediation on the coast?
So everyone in America is subject to climate, including people in middle America. In fact, the best money we can spend is what I'm talking about, which is pushing not to have horrible climate outcomes. The reason that I declare a state of emergency on day one is so we don't get to the point where we have to spend unlimited amounts of money to protect people on the coast. Because when you really look about what it would take to protect the coasts of the United States or the interior of the United States in the worst climate outcomes, that's more money than anyone can imagine. And let me give you an example on this. Look, I'm from California, and I was talking to somebody in San Diego 2 months ago who's an environmentalist. And I said, what are you guys doing? They said, we're talking about managed retreat. I said, what's managed retreat? And they said, moving San Diego. I said, moving San Diego, that doesn't make any sense. How do you move a city? How do you move one office building? They were like, well, we're thinking maybe we're going to have to move to the interior. That is more money than anyone can spend. Anyone in the interior of the United States, anyone on the coast of the United States. There's a reason that I'm saying I declare a climate emergency, because managed retreat is not really an option in this world. That I want to make sure that we act aggressively to stop this, because, you know, the old American saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, in this case, I think an ounce of prevention is worth about 100 pounds of cure. And if we get to the point where we have managed retreat in Miami and San Diego, look, we spent, I think, $20 billion fixing up New Orleans. It's a fraction the size of Miami, and it's a fraction the size of San Diego. And so if we get into that world, there's a reason I want to spend $2 trillion in federal infrastructure spending in a climate smart way, because that is a great investment in this country. That is a great investment in a safe America and a prosperous future. That's great money for this country to spend, so we don't have to start moving office buildings from San Diego to New Mexico.
Many of the coalition members and our readers talk about water, drinking water. It's a top priority for the mayors. And so how do you prevent another Flint? Because they're coming. I mean, we all know that those pipes have come to the end of their lives.
Yes. So there's a reason I'm spending $2 trillion and causing municipalities and states to spend trillions more. It's not just that we have old pipes. Flint wasn't a story about old pipes, just so you understand. Flint was a story about a state governor and a state administration switching a virtually all-black city from safe drinking water onto the Flint River. And let's be clear, they switched the city and one GM plant onto the Flint River, and the GM called up and said, the water is corroding our machinery. And they took the plant off the Flint River, but left the kids of Flint, Michigan on the Flint River. So we're gonna have to spend a ton of money fixing up those pipes, that's true. But you've got to see that when you go around the United States and see who lives in Flint, Michigan, and who lives in Denmark, South Carolina, and who lives in the San Joaquin Valley and East Porterville, the places you get sick from drinking the water, we are poisoning black and brown communities at a completely different level than everybody else. And so when I talk about climate, I start with environmental justice, and I always have, because I know that if we're gonna fix the climate problem, we start with the water problem and the air problem, and if we fix the air problem and the water problem, we're gonna get, the climate problem is gonna be just fine. So I'm really, just so you know, I'm an environmental justice person. To me, climate is about protecting the people of the United States, and I start with the people who are being poisoned the most, which are black and brown communities.
So I think we have time for one more question, and this takes us a place we haven't quite been yet. Tom Blythe from St. Petersburg, Florida asks, what's your vision to build a rapid rail system in the U.S.? The U.S. is behind the rest of the developed world in this regard, and that provides environmental benefits as well as faster and safer travel. How and where would you implement such a program?
Well, as you know, we're trying to get this done in California, and it's difficult politically. I got that. Look, we need more public transportation, and we need cleaner public transportation, and it's a huge issue. One of the things I worked on that I'm very proud about is Measure M in Los Angeles. And Measure M, was the blinding insight in Los Angeles that they needed a subway system. And so that's gonna create the original idea, it passed in 2016. The original idea, and you think about the LA traffic, what you're trying to get away from, and think about the cost of all that traffic. But then also know that it was originally supposed to provide 500,000 good jobs. And it doesn't have the word union in them, but they're overwhelmingly union jobs. The most recent estimate I've heard is 778,000 jobs. We are going to have to build more public transportation. The kind of things like high-speed rail is a really good idea. We cannot go spend the rest of our lives depending on single-family cars. And so that's part of rebuilding this country, is gonna have more concentrated housing and more public transportation. And fast, high-speed public rail is a great way for us to go, and we're gonna have to move to things like that. We're gonna have a more interesting life, but we're gonna have to be open to changing some things from the way they've been.
Tom Starry, thank you for joining us. I look forward to that interesting life. But you've been nice to share your vision of it with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think next up on the list, and I think we're about ready. By the way, one of the amazing things about this topic is that it is sprawling, like transportation systems. There's so many assets, so many aspects to it. It's unbelievable. But we'll keep rolling down the path with our next candidate, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Senator Klobuchar.
What a great group.
They're warmed up for you. It's okay.
Okay, good.
That's good.
But I think that you mentioned the AFL-CIO and the operating engineers and the transport union, but we did not mention the carpenters that are here, which is actually, they have a major training facility that I got to visit near Vegas, and there's going to be a lot of openings for carpenters in the future, so I want to thank them as well.
Good for you. So infrastructure is the topic. And we were just talking about what a sprawling topic it is, but let's start at the 10,000-foot level, which we've been trying to do with all the candidates, which is to talk a little bit about priorities and principles. So infrastructure is a lot of things. It means fixing roads, fixing bridges, filling potholes, making better airports, ports. But it also means what a lot of Democrats think it should mean anyway, which is shifting the country to a more green, climate-friendly transportation system and infrastructure. You got limited resources. There's a $1 trillion deficit right now. As president, what's your higher priority? Fixing the old or moving to a green new infrastructure system?
Well, you have to do both. And my plan, my over $1 trillion plan, I was the first candidate in the race to come out with a major infrastructure plan. And a lot of that was actually because of my own experience. And I'll just start out with that so I can see everyone. I'm a little shorter than some of the other candidates. The mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, and the president were going at it on Twitter about the president said that the mayor was only 5'4", and the mayor said that's not true. I'm 5'8". I am the only candidate that is 5'4". I want that out there now.
And willing to admit it.
Yeah, there we are. So the for me, the infrastructure issue and the reason that I've led with that in the presidential campaign and the reason that I led the Senate infrastructure bill for the Democrats in 2011 is this. I actually live just 8 blocks from where that bridge fell down on the middle of a beautiful summer day, the 35W bridge in Minneapolis. That wasn't just a bridge, it was an 8-lane highway. And as I said that day, a bridge just doesn't fall down in the middle of America, but it did. And when it falls down, we've got to fix it, and then we have to step back and look at what is going on with infrastructure in this country. And so that took me to that place. But the other piece of the story that has been always with me is what happened with our community when that happened. The whole world was watching. What did they see? They saw an off-duty firefighter, a union firefighter, who tethered herself to the side of the river and drove in and out of that Mississippi River and that murky water among those 55 cars and trucks looking for survivors. They saw a Tasty truck driver who had literally 1 second to decide what to do. He's going down, the bridge is collapsing. He can save his life by running into the back of a school bus full of kids, or he can veer off to almost a certain death. He veers off, saves the kid, but burns to death in that cab. Then there's a school bus that plummets 30 feet down. There's a guy named Hernandez, a school counselor, who's on that bus. And he literally, in the second the doors open up in the back, he's got 1 second to decide what he's gonna do. He could have gotten off himself, but instead he gets all 30 kids off that bus to safety. That's our country. So when we think about infrastructure, and I know we're going deep in the policy details here, we have to also remember that our public works and our public good is a part of who we are as a nation and looking out for each other. And that's one of the major jobs of government. The major job is keeping our citizens safe, and it is also shared prosperity, and I think infrastructure is a great way to get there. So in answer to the question, I think you've got to both fix existing problems like roads and bridges, major part of my plan, but then make sure we are meeting the, what I call remember when they had the rural electrification of our time? That's rural broadband. Right now, we can get rural service for not just cell service, but also high-speed internet on Iceland with all its volcanoes, more easy than we can get it in northern Nevada, okay? That doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of work that has to be done there, our schools, and then green infrastructure. And when I look at this, rail, I just heard my friend Tom Steyer and some of the things that he was talking about, all good. But when we rebuild existing infrastructure, we have to make that climate resilient. When we build new infrastructure, that always has to be on our minds as well. So it's got to be a combination of things. And I think it's very important for any candidate in this race, if you're going to start talking about infrastructure, when we've got a president that made a bunch of promises. I still remember that night on election night, watching his speech. I bet many of you do too. Do you remember one of the things that he promised? Infrastructure. That was one of the top 3 things. And while Congress has kept the funding going in so many areas, we have not seen the big infrastructure investment that he promised. Not one that keeps our country competitive, not only in light of climate change, but also competitive with the rest of the world when it comes to being this great nation that's supposed to make stuff and invent things and export to the world.
Senator,
to do
that
that, you
raises-
need transportation to get your products to market.
So, Senator, that raises a second question that we've been trying to put to everyone. You mentioned your $1 trillion plan. So the question is, where does the money come from? We all know that the Highway Trust Fund is being depleted, and the gas tax, no one wants to raise it. So how do you raise that $1 trillion to pay for everything that you would like to do?
Okay, so once again, the reason we didn't get a good infrastructure package is that the president, despite these promises, wouldn't work to pay for it and get it done. And he basically blew up a meeting with congressional leadership instead of facing the issue that you got to find a way to pay for it. Instead, he did that tax bill, the Trump tax bill, and it would have been the perfect opportunity to combine that tax bill with some tax reductions, like bringing the corporate rate down some, but he went so far and basically sucked all the money out of the system that you could have used for infrastructure. And then after he signed it, he went down to Mar-a-Lago and said to all his friends, "You just got a lot richer." Were any of you in that room? Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't want to embarrass anyone or anything like that. So this is how I would pay for it. I would take those Trump tax cuts where the corporate tax rate went down from the mid-30s to 21%. Every point it went down was $100 billion. So you could still have reduced it and used a bunch of money for transportation. So I would take the first 4 points of it and get $400 billion out of that. Then I would take the international tax rate. If you put it back to where it was under Obama, that is $150 billion you get out of that. So now we're up to $550 billion. Then for the rest of it, I would do Infrastructure Financing Authority. That is a bipartisan proposal that has long been floating around Congress. In the U.S. Senate, it is a proposal between Senator Warner and Senator Blunt, and it has a lot of potential to pass. We'd also want to make sure that it goes to good projects and that we distribute the money fairly across the United States, but that would create a lot of backbone for the backbone of our infrastructure. And then in addition to that, I would do the Buy America bonds, which again, in the Senate as well as in the House, but in the Senate is a bipartisan proposal between Senator Wyden, who's the ranking member on the Finance Committee, as well as Senator Hoeven. Why do I mention these names? Hoeven's a Republican from North Dakota. Well, I think having a president that knows who people are and has the experience to try to get that done is going to matter when we put together this package. And the difference between a plan and a pipe dream is that a plan, there's a way to pay for it, and there's a way to get it done.
So let me take you back to the internet, the broadband build-out question, because there's kind of a tension here between gigabytes and roads, I guess, because there's limited resources. So does the government pay for that build-out? I'm from Kansas, you're from Minnesota. It gets to places that don't get it otherwise. But is that the government's responsibility, or should that be the responsibility of the big carriers? And if it's the government that does it, who owns it? Does the government own it, or does it turn it over to those companies to make money off of the network that's built?
It is a combination of responsibility, and I actually, in another life, did telecom law in the private sector for years. I represented MCI when they were trying to bust into the local and long-distance markets and create more competition, which helped to bring those rates down. And so that experience helps me to get this. I also serve on the Commerce Committee. My plan is to get this done by 2022. And there's every reason to think we can do that, to connect every area of the country, not to like dial up slow speed, but to actual high-speed internet. And the way you pay for it is a combination of things. One, as part of the infrastructure plan I just mentioned, but two, some of the money can come from the Universal Service Fund, which is traditionally used, of course, for underserved areas, would be there, impoverished urban areas, rural areas, and you want to be able to pay for local service for emergencies for people, but some of that money can go to broadband as well. One of the problems that I have identified spending a lot of time in rural areas and meeting with people and small telephone companies and the like is sometimes that money is going to carriers that aren't using it, particularly some of the bigger carriers or mid-sized ones that aren't using it to actually build out. So you have this crazy patchwork situation where one town in one area will have high-speed internet and the other won't. I remember being in a tribal area in Minnesota where one of the houses had decided to pay, a kid's house had decided to pay for high-speed internet, which was very expensive because they didn't have it on the reservation. And all these kids every day would go to the guy's yard to do their homework. Or the doctor can get, of course, internet in the hospital, but he can't get it at home, and you have emergency calls, so he would have to, if he wanted to bring up an x-ray or look at other things, he has to go to the McDonald's parking lot. Or the farmer, and farming has become increasingly high-tech with the machinery and the like, who wants to contact customers, has to go to drive miles to go to a Target. I mean, that's what's happening. So I think the answer is a combination of things like everything else if you're realistic. It's getting the direct funding in through this infrastructure package. Right now the funding for internet goes through the USDA as well as the Commerce Department. The USDA handles smaller things. There are kind of local government-owned situations in some of the rural areas. Actually, one of them, the Blandon Foundation in Minnesota, has spent a lot of time working on this, and I just don't think it's one size fits all. But the key is to make sure the money is not going to phone companies that aren't using it. Senator Thune and I, the Republican from South Dakota, have done some work on this to try to get people with standalone internet, standalone cell phone service to get better internet service. There's a bunch of things we can do, but you have to have a president step back, look at all these programs, and figure out, it's literally mapping. Oh, I passed a bill for mapping, by the way. Mapping exactly so we have accurate data about where it is and where it isn't, and then we get the resources to where they're supposed to go.
To follow on this topic, is that the big companies have seen the government coming. And so they've gone into many states and passed laws that says the government can't come in and create a public-owned broadband system. So what do you do about those laws that would stand in the way of trying to get into some of these communities?
Well, there's always ways. First of all, you can create incentives if that's the way we're going, that those states aren't going to get certain resources if they put those in place. The second thing is to do preemption with some kind of major national drive for broadband. And I think it just depends when the mapping's done and we get all the data on how we want the money to be spent and where we want it to go, because a whole bunch of money is going where it shouldn't, and then of course there's not enough funding. It puts our country at such a disadvantage. I see it because in Minnesota we can see Canada from our porch, and for years we saw how the resorts over in Canada had better service, so they were able to get customers and they were able to get people that could get those customers that we can't get in our state. And we've made some major improvements in northern Minnesota on that front, and I'm sure you see the same thing in parts of Nevada.
So you're president. You get to do what you want. Do you want to build a high-speed rail network in this country? And by the way, if you do, that's more popular in populated areas on the East Coast where we live now than in the Midwest and rural areas where you and I kind of come from.
Oh, you haven't gone on that Empire Builder. Pretty popular.
I haven't been on the
I can
Empire
see you
Builder,
don't know
true.
what it
No.
is. No, that is there's just a rail
not very
from
high speed.
You guys know it may not be high speed.
It's gonna
Thank
say.
you, one person. But that is from Chicago, and it's across the West. And there's just a lot of interest in train travel in the middle of the country as well, and going to Glacier and going to our national parks. It's actually a really popular thing. But on the high speed, yes, I mean, that's going to be more of a need for major cities. But I will say, like, let's say even where I just was for some reason in New Hampshire, the Manchester area has the highest density of an area that doesn't have any commuter rail at all. So it is a combination of some of these shorter commuter rails, which really aren't as expensive, as well as these high-speed rails. Because when you are on those high-speed rails, which I'm sure a number of you have tried out in other countries, whether it be in Europe or in Japan or the like, you're able to see how efficient that is. And so I'm just a big believer in rail. I love it because it's one way my husband and I can travel where we don't have an argument about directions. I also like it because it's better for the environment and it's a good way to get around. And it, of course, as the operating engineers and so many people out there know, creates good paying union jobs.
So, as I'm sure you know, we solicited questions from members of the coalition and Wall Street Journal readers. So we're going to turn to some of those questions right now. So Camille asks, what would you do to speed up the process to get some of these new projects going? Are there regulations, as the Trump administration has asserted, that can be changed? Are there any that you would set aside in the interest of saving money and speeding up the process?
Well, I am one that's always open to looking at rules and regulations to see if you can make them work better. However, I'm not going to mess around with safety or the environment or things like that. So I think you've got to look at each rule and say, are there things we can do to make it work a little bit better? But I will tell you my background. My grandpa was an underground miner who worked 1,500 feet underground. And back then, the mines were incredibly unsafe. The sirens would go off and everyone would run to the mines. My grandma, all of the spouses and the families, never knowing which miner had been killed or maimed. And it was unions that made a difference because those safety rules were put in place. So that's something that is near and dear to my heart. And then in terms of approvals and the like, you can always step back and look at things. One of the things that I would like to see, for instance, is a 2-year budgeting cycle. I think that would help us to, when we put money out there, then we would have another year to look back to see how it was spent and to make sure it does get spent instead of sitting there. I think there's things you can do that would kind of speed things up, like we did with some of the work we did with the stimulus bill, because a lot of that money did get out there. And make sure that the money is getting out so the projects can be built, in addition to looking at red tape and if there's anything we can do to speed things up. But I did want to mention one thing that's really important to me, and that is prevailing wages. When I actually was in local office, I had a full-time lawyer that worked on prevailing wage for our biggest county, which was over 1 million people. And then that person helped other smaller counties to work on prevailing wage. And I just think if you're going to build whatever it is, whether it is a bridge or whether it is a highway or whether it is rail, that you want to make sure that the wages are fair for our workers, because the whole idea here is to allow people to share in the prosperity of our transportation system.
So, Senator, let me take you to another infrastructure topic we haven't touched on yet, airports. Michael from Raleigh, North Carolina, asks this. He says, U.S. airports have not seen investments from federal funding or user fees go up in 20 years. At my airport in North Carolina, due to a slow-moving federal approval process and funding challenges, the airport's maintaining a runway one slab at a time. As president, would you support adjusting the user fee paid by passengers to allow for long-term investments? And adjusting is a nice word for raising. Would you raise it?
Yeah, that's a very nice word. I would be certainly open to that, and it hasn't been raised for a long time. And we'd want to do it in a way that's fair. But I hate the thought that our airports are lagging behind. And I think you see here, I was just on your landing in Las Vegas. I was just on the tram. It was very good and worked well. That went between the terminals. I have a hub in Minnesota, so I'm well acquainted with the issues there. That's been a very successful hub, actually. Some of the issues there, of course, for us, which I'm sure you've had in Nevada, is just some of the TSA issues and not having enough workers there. At some point, it was so bad that I had to get the TSA to get dog teams from Maui. The poor dogs had to go from Hawaii to Minnesota in the middle of the winter to speed up our lines because we were having so much trouble. So I think it is a combination of upgrading our infrastructure. That is one way to do it. The other is direct investment, as I've proposed in this infrastructure package, and just making it a big priority. You also have small and mid-sized airports that don't need all the deluxe things you might use, like trams in some of the bigger ones. But I think we also want to make sure, and those are the rural airport issues, that we keep those going as well to be able to have a real transportation system. I'm the ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee in the Senate. I know that sounds really exciting, but it actually, there's a lot of issues with airline mergers and the like to make sure that we keep our small and medium-sized cities' airports going. Because otherwise their rates can go, as you know, way up sky high if we don't have competition. It can be a real problem. So there are issues related to airports and our airport system, independent of the facility upgrades. But I do think that we need to continue to upgrade our airports if we're going to be able to compete.
Senator, just to touch on quickly one more issue that's very important to this audience. Kevin of Milwaukee asks whether, as president, would you think the federal government can provide cities much more help to address clean water issues, drinking water, and particularly in disadvantaged areas?
Yes. Having been to Flint and seeing that after all this time, they are still using bottled water in a number of the homes and a number of facilities in Flint. I met with the mayor there, and everyone has bottled water. That is so sad. And by the way, that is just one example. These examples are all over the country. One of the interesting things about water projects is that they're not always the bright, shiny object for the political ribbon cutting that you have with highway overpasses or with a brand new commuter rail system, but they are just as important. So investing in water infrastructure, and by the way, in states like Nevada, as you look at the water shortage, yes, it's about water infrastructure and the pipes and the upgrades, especially in light of climate change, but it's also about looking at incentives for conservation, for water, as well as, by the way, water storage, so that we make sure that the water we do get, that we're keeping stored, the surface water and the like, so we can use that. So I think water in general is going to be a very hot topic and has not been addressed on the federal level as much as it should be, and it's something that me, from the land of 10,000 lakes, would be more than happy to make one of my priorities.
Senator Klobuchar, I know you have to go out and use that infrastructure system, roads, bridges, airports, to hit the campaign trail again. But thank you for taking some time to talk about it with us, and good luck out there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody.
So I think before we move on to our final candidate, Zach from United for Infrastructure is going to join us for a couple more minutes.
Thank you, Jerry. So it's been a great conversation today with the presidential candidates, talking about issues at the federal level. And I just want to acknowledge all the work that's also happening at the local level, that mayors and city councils and governors and county officials have been doing to make progress on this issue. And I know that's something that you guys got questions on and took on in your research. What would you want to ask about how the federal government can work with state and local governments to make progress here.
One of the most interesting things that one of the experts was talking to us about was how local governments need so much extra help. And the money flows through the state and then is parceled out, raising the question of whether some more direct loans to cities and counties might be possible, because people go on this great federally owned highway and then they take a really terrific ramp and then they end up in a pothole. So it's, you know, those are the roads that most Americans are driving to the grocery store, to school. I mean, that's their primary experience with the U.S. infrastructure system. And I thought that was a really insightful thought.
And I would also add that, and we have a mayor coming up to talk about this, thankfully, or former mayor. But one of the other things that becomes clear when you talk to people about this is that one of the issues mayors have to deal with is the one that Senator Klobuchar was saying is not the glamorous one, but water and sewer. That sort of falls to mayors to deal with. And it's expensive, it's not popular, it's not fun, and the federal government probably isn't providing as much help as it should. And everybody goes back to Flint, but it's not only Flint. There are other places where you have similar problems. And so I think if the question is, what do mayors worry about? One of the things that struck me as we went through our research was mayors worry about water, and mayors worry about sewer because nobody else does.
And I know I'm turning the tables here on the question askers. Yeah. But you know, as members of the press, what is it you look for in an infrastructure story to help communicate an incredibly complex issue that is esoteric for so many Americans and communicate it to a broad audience, especially a readership like the Wall Street Journal who works on these fundamental economic issues all the time, but it may not be specifically infrastructure. How do you think about communicating on infrastructure?
Well, I'll start and then Jean can jump in. But I mean, one of the reasons I rattle off some of those fun facts at the beginning when we first started here today is that I think you have to convince people of the magnitude of the issue. It's, because everybody knows about the bridge down the street that's been closed for repairs all summer, and it really annoys them. But I think the way if you're a national news organization like the Wall Street Journal, the way you deal with this is you turn it into not a local or a narrow or an isolated problem, but a national issue. And that's what we're talking about here. And I think that's the first step in explaining the process to readers. And we talked about this earlier, the other thing is to try to convey somehow the difficulty Washington has. And we're both from Washington, obviously. So the difficulty Washington has figuring out how to come to terms with this. Everybody says they want to do infrastructure. It's the only, one of the very few lines in President Trump's State of the Union address last month, right, that got bipartisan applause when he said, we should do an infrastructure bill. One of the few times on that night when both sides, Republicans and Democrats, both stood up and applauded. People have been talking about it. President Trump, Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer have been talking about this since literally the transition to the Trump administration, but nothing happened. So the other thing that I think we have to come to terms with is why. Why doesn't something happen when everybody says it needs to?
And there could still be a piece of legislation that comes through, but it's mostly going to be a highway bill. It's not the big infrastructure package that all of the leaders in Washington say is needed for the country. And when you talk about writing about it, the one thing that always strikes me is an infrastructure story is one of the easiest to turn into a people's story. And those are the most compelling to write, and they're the most compelling to read. It's one of the reasons the Flint story resonated so well with the American public, and the public demanded that something be done in Flint, and they wanted to know who was responsible, because as much as it was a minority community, it could have been anybody's kid. I mean, they made a mistake, yes, and it was more of a financial problem than a pipe problem, but we've had pipe problems elsewhere, and these pipes are all aging. And so I think they are the kind of stories that you can draw readers in a sense that they can think, huh, that could be me?
Zach, I think we appreciate your questioning us. It's very nice of you to do that. But I think that more important than us, there's one more presidential candidate waiting. So anyway, thanks for coming out again, and thanks for having
Thanks
us
again,
here.
Jerry.
And speaking of mayors, we actually happen to have a former mayor right there. It's Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I'll be brief in introducing our infrastructure vision because I'm looking forward to sitting and having a conversation together. But first of all, I just want to acknowledge and thank everyone who is so committed to making sure that we take real steps when it comes to infrastructure, because this is a mayor's native language. I'm so excited to finally be with a group of people who care about wastewater as much as I do. There we go, see? Look, it isn't always sexy, but it is so important. The infrastructure that is above ground, the infrastructure that is underground, and the digital infrastructure that is going to help decide whether the future works for America or not. The governing image of my campaign is the image of what it's going to be like the first time the sun comes up and Donald Trump is no longer in the White House. I look forward to it too. But our political objective, obviously, among everybody in my party running for president, is to bring that day about. When that day comes, then comes the hard part. That sun will be coming up over an environment where our country is facing challenges, some of which were barely understood just a few years ago, and doing it in an environment characterized by a level of division and political polarization, the likes of which we haven't seen in modern times. And yet, one of the things the American people actually agree on is the need for a major investment in the future of our infrastructure. It's the one area where I will admit I think the president had a lot of us fooled, because it sounded like a good idea when he said he was going to do real infrastructure. It was popular in both parties. It was going to help the economy. And then they come out with the vaunted plan, and it turned out the plan was for us state and local officials to do most of the work and come up with most of the money, which is how it already works. We have an opportunity to do something different and take infrastructure week back from being a punchline and actually make sure that it is the template for a better future. In order to meet our climate goals, in order to meet our economic goals, we've got to do this. And we've got to come together to make sure that it actually happens. I've proposed a plan that will do that across every level of the infrastructure that we need, and do it with an eye toward equity, too. Because we know that the racial and economic inequality we experience in this country plays out through the inferior infrastructure that so many Americans are expected to put up with. And we don't have to do that anymore if we are willing to come together, make the investments, change the way that politics twists our infrastructure priorities, and deliver on something that the American people already want, already expect, and already insist that we do something about. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, and thanks so much for having us together.
Well, thank you so much. We do want to ask every one of the candidates, you've got limited amount of money in the federal government. You become president. And you, more than any of the other candidates that we've talked to, have dealt with the part of the crumbling infrastructure that people talk about. And yet there are a lot of proposals for fancy new things. So where do you see the balance? Like, how much of the money would the government really need to focus on fixing things first before creating a new high-speed rail?
Yeah, I think this is really important, because sometimes the exciting, look, as a political figure, you have a lot of incentive to create the exciting new thing, but we got to get back to basics too. And so mine is the only infrastructure plan that works to make sure that federal funding that goes to states for fixing roads actually fixes what we've got, in addition to adding new and exciting things. We cannot continue to add new pieces out there if we're not willing to look after what we've already got. And we're seeing right now a built physical plant that is not being fully maintained, which is part of how we got the crisis of environmental and racial justice that is Flint. We have got to deal with the unsexy things first. Now, the good news is It is possible to do that and to add to things like rail. I believe that we should be increasing. I'm not asking for Japanese level standard of train travel. I would settle for an Italian level of train travel. It would still be a hell of a lot better than what we have right now, and an important part of how we meet our climate goals, because it is easier to decarbonize medium range travel over rail than it is in a lot of other areas, from personally owned vehicles to air travel. All of this has to be part of a smart mix to get us toward the goals that we have toward 2050.
So I think in your plan, you said you would inject $165 billion into the Highway Trust Fund. That Highway Trust Fund is financed through the federal gas tax. So where would you get the $165 billion? Would you do that by raising the gas tax? And by the way, in a sort of more radical thought perhaps, when interest rates are as low as they are now, is this the sort of thing that the government shouldn't worry about paying for, because you can borrow the money for next to nothing, and that's where we should go in terms of dealing with the kind of money we're talking about to deal with infrastructure?
Well, I don't think we should be fundamentalist about the uses of debt finance for infrastructure, because in a low interest rate environment, there can be a lot of virtue to infrastructure investments that, unlike what we were told about tax cuts for the wealthiest, actually have been demonstrated to pay for themselves. That being said, I think the time has come for my party to assert its ownership of fiscal responsibility, because the other party that has talked about it all the time has reached new heights of walking away from it, with this president putting $1 trillion deficit before the American people without even bothering to explain how there might be some way to deal with it. And so I believe in having pay-fors for all of the things that my campaign puts forward. And we can do it. And I'm not even talking about going back to Eisenhower-level taxation. I'm talking about rolling back the Trump corporate tax cut. I'm talking about closing the loopholes and make it possible for companies that earn billions of dollars in profits to pay less than I did on my mayor's salary last year in federal income taxes, specifically zero. And when it comes to the gas tax, look, the reality is we are going to have to graduate from the gas tax, because we're going to have to graduate from gas. We know that it is not a viable long-term funding mechanism for our highways. We got some time to make that transition. I think that we can bring parties to the table and identify alternatives. I think something that links to vehicle miles traveled is attractive only if we can answer some of the big brother dimensions of what it means to actually assess vehicle miles traveled, and we should be serious.
Do you think those can be addressed, the big brother?
I think it can be. I mean, look, we're already in a society where we've got way too much of our personal data being tracked in way too many ways, and so we ought to be smart about it. But I do think that we can come together and find a solution.
You've also mentioned climate action bonds. Tell us, what are those bonds and what do they build?
So the idea is to create a financing mechanism, again, for investments that we know, at least in an environment where you have carbon pricing and the true cost of carbon reflected in our economy, will in fact have a meaningful return. And there are so many worthy climate projects that still don't happen because of a lack of financing. It's one thing to get an energy savings contract to solarize a small business or a home. It's another for, well, a community like mine, for example, to be able to lay out the kind of car charging infrastructure we would really want to in order to move into the electric vehicle future. There are so many things that are being put together at the local and community level. And in climate, I know we think about this as a national issue and a global issue, and of course it is. But so many of the innovations are actually happening at the local level. So not only would I convene make sure that we join the Paris Agreement on day one, but I would convene a Pittsburgh summit of local and regional actors, because the answers don't all have to come from Washington. Maybe, again, this is the mayor's eye view, but I think the answers don't all have to come from Washington. It's just more of the support and more of the financing should.
So let me take you back to that land of the mayors and the less sexy water and sewer issues that got you a big cheer over here.
Yeah, I'm glad we got a wastewater section over here. That's awesome. The wastewater vote is not always as vocal, so I'm enjoying this a lot.
I'm pretty sure you locked it up today. But I think as mayor of South Bend, you took advantage of a Trump administration program to ease some of the environmental requirements of the Obama administration when it came to dealing with wastewater and sewage that flows into rivers. So the question is, did the Trump administration have it right on that subject, and the Obama administration go too far?
So here's the problem with the Trump administration's rollbacks is they are actually about lowering the standard of water quality. Now, there was a problem in the old regulatory framework, and the problem was this. It held cities accountable, and still does in many ways, not for the environmental result you get on the back end, but for how much money you put in on the front end. So whether you pour in a lot of money and it doesn't quite work, or whether you pour in a lot of money and actually get the job done, it almost, the framework can't really tell the difference. What we did was we used technology to create a system that would, at a dramatically lower cost for our low-income ratepayers, still be able to lead to less pollution going into the river. And we do need the flexibility to do that, but it's not about walking away from our commitment to environmental quality. It's about being outcome-focused instead of input-oriented.
But as a general proposition, do you think the federal government gives mayors and even governors too little flexibility on some of these matters?
I think what's happened in practice is it's really varied by the regions. I found that I could often get the administration to listen, but sometimes those forms of innovation and flexibility weren't always making their way through the regional offices. And it's one of the reasons I think we need to set up our federal administration to listen to the voices of mayors who are actually solving these problems better than it currently does. And needless to say, bringing that perspective in the White House, we will.
Well, let's reverse that perspective for just a second. If the federal government and your administration were to have the Green New Deal as a high priority, then should the federal government have more say in questions of land use? And I raised this before. We have the Cape Cod wind farm that is over 16 years in the making, and it's not there. And planners say to be really efficient, you need to put these new green sources of energy close to where people are because you need to transmit it to them. And so you're getting right in the heart of some local areas and cities. So should the federal government, should there be a different role for the federal government other than maybe eminent domain, but some other change in that conversation and that balance of power?
I think a lot of those issues start to sort themselves out in the market if we have carbon pricing, which is why I think we need to make that move. In other words, instead of trying to engineer every piece of it from a Washington perspective, let's make sure that the market signals are actually in keeping with the advantages in a world that prices carbon appropriately to things like wind power. And yes, the federal government should, of course, be encouraging greater use of renewable energy and greater development of innovative techniques. But I think a lot of the federal role is actually further upstream. It's on the research side. Remember, think of it this way. Only private industry could invent something like the iPhone, right? But only federal research could invent something like the internet. And what we need to do is be putting more in the basic research on energy storage, carbon storage, and renewable energy generation that market actors can then take and run with.
So you come from a river city. River cities are worried about the effects of climate change. You've talked about this some. Coastal cities are worried about the effects of climate change. Should part of an infrastructure plan, part of your plan, be to spend tax dollars to help river cities and coastal cities deal with the effects of climate change? And if so, are you prepared to tell people who don't live in those areas that they're going to have to bucket up and spend some of their money to fix those problems or to prevent those problems?
We do have to commit federal dollars to this, I believe. And by the way, we can create a lot of jobs when we do. But it's why we need to invest in funding to enhance the resiliency of river and coastal communities. We're going to need a sea-level defense fund. And we're going to need to invest in regional resilience hubs that can deal with the local impacts of climate, whether it's river flooding in a city like mine or wildfire risk in parts of the West. Look, it's going to be different everywhere you go. When I was on the Mayor's Water Council, I felt like there were three kinds of mayors talking about water. There were Western mayors who didn't have any water. There were coastal mayors who had too much water. And then there were Midwestern mayors like me with water in all the wrong places. And the solutions are going to be different, and that's okay. But we do need more federal funding, and yes, that's something that has to have federal leadership. You can't expect the locals to be able to handle all this on their own.
Can I back up to your point about using the federal government for research and development. The Pentagon right now is doing the most work in trying to create a renewable fuel source that could be used in airplanes. Would you be looking to set standards of renewable fuel standards for airplanes at some point, and would you invest deeper in that research?
Yeah, we're going to have to in order to meet our goals. Remember, I mean, the IPCC is telling us that 2030 is the deadline to make a lot of changes. I think the real deadline is a political one of 2020, because if we don't have a president who believes in climate science by 2021, we're not going to make it. But if you look out to 2050, when we got to be carbon neutral in order to stay ahead of the worst catastrophic impacts, that means that we got to go from light transportation through heavy transportation and air travel into heavy industry by 2050. And to make it on that curve, the military should be leading the way. Part of the problem with climate right now is a lot of the very parts of our society that could be on the leading edge are not really being viewed as part of the solution. The military is an example. Farming is a huge example. You know, the potential for carbon capture in soil is enormous. And industrial workers are another example. You know, we're estimating that between my infrastructure plan and my climate plan, we're going to create about 8 million new jobs. And a lot of, when you hear green jobs, you picture very exotic things, right? Somebody fine-tuning a solar panel or rappelling down a windmill or whatever it is. And there's some of that is out there, and that's great. But a lot of these green jobs are very easy to understand today. I'm talking about union glaziers and insulators and electrical workers and carpenters who are going to be needed just for the building retrofits we got to do. And so across society, whether we're talking about the military, as your question raised, or whether we're talking about labor, or whether we're talking about farming, we've got to make this into a national mobilization where everybody understands how they've been recruited to be part of the solution. If we get it right, we're creating opportunity along the way too.
So, Mayor Buttigieg, we solicited questions from Wall Street Journal readers, but also from members of the United for Infrastructure Coalition. And so, with the last few minutes we have available, we wanted to turn to some of those. So, Mike asks the following: what priority would you assign, and what actions would you finally take to fix the antiquated Northeast Corridor rail corridor, particularly the single track and the single track out condition under the Hudson River that millions of Americans use every year?
Yeah, I mean, again, we've got to decide whether we think it's okay for the greatest country in the world to have inferior transportation when it comes to rail. It just doesn't make sense. And I don't know why Americans should be tolerating inferior service relative to fellow members of industrialized economies. And so whether we're talking about the Northeast Corridor and the work that needs to happen there, or whether we're looking at the bigger picture nationally, we're going to need investment, but we're also going to need federal leadership to make sure that the parties are talking to each other. And if you've ever tried to get your calls returned by freight rail, you know how many steps are going to be needed to get different parties to talk to each other. It's the same thing in my part of the country, where we're linking, thankfully, on dedicated rail, but we're working to link South Bend and Chicago more quickly through double tracking. And these things don't happen without federal leadership. It's why we need to make sure that we're bringing the parties to the table, but also why we need to double build grants. Which, again, is going right into our economy, and ensure that federal funding is backing those federal expectations.
So John of Las Vegas has raised a question here that's important to everyone in this audience, and that is the dependence on the Colorado River and Lake Mead and other reservoirs for daily water supplies, you know, for 40 million Americans, including 2 million who are here. So he asks, how would you direct your Secretary of the Interior to address the threats presented by drought and climate change in the Colorado River Basin?
There's not going to be any easy solutions here, but this is another example of where not only do we need to engage the stakeholders who are currently in a framework that was designed nearly a century ago based on the realities then. We also need to be doing research on the kinds of conservation that can be done on everything from the management of cities to agriculture. It's part of why I would propose we create an ARPA-I. So we got ARPA-E after the model of DARPA for energy. ARPA-I would be for infrastructure and on creating solutions for everything from better use of water resources to what I think ought to be a Manhattan project for a way to pave roads that lasts longer than 12 years or so. Every mayor who's gotten thousands of calls about potholes views this with a certain emotional passion. Because we basically haven't changed a lot of the technology we use for paving in a fundamental way in a few hundred years. These are the kinds of things where we can lead the way, even as we're doing the sort of intergovernmental and political work, to make sure that there is an equitable distribution of resources. The last thing I would mention when it comes to water is we have got to do a much better job of engaging tribal stakeholders. And the idea of free, prior, informed consent needs to be taken seriously and needs to be enshrined in federal policy.
By the way, just as we go along here, I wanted to ask, do you think federal funds ought to be used to build a recharging station network for electric vehicles, or is that a private sector priority?
I think that we should be open to public-private models that might help accelerate what can be done with limited federal funds. But I do view this as potentially a form of critical infrastructure. Now, before we go too far making irreversible investments of capital in that infrastructure, let's make sure that it takes into account the development of technology. And what I mean by this is, I remember a lot of buildings in the late 1990s that were, huge investments were made to make sure that the whole thing, top to bottom, was wired with Cat5 and Ethernet cable. And they put the finishing touch on the building 2 years before Wi-Fi was a thing, right? And so let's make sure we're tuning what we're going to do with charging capacity to what's going to change in terms of the storage capacity on board of vehicles. This is why we need to make sure that we're doing this in an integrated way. And it's why we need to have national policy leadership instead of expecting different stakeholders to be able to go off and solve it on their own.
Marco, Marco, of Utah, says, Mayor Pete, you recently released infrastructure plan calls for creation of 50 billion, so 500 billion, so 10-year drinking water assistance matching fund. Explain how that will help low-income communities and Americans as a whole.
Yes, so this is especially important for low-income communities because of things like the lessons of Flint. Look, to me, this is actually a question of freedom, because part of your freedom depends on the fact that chances are, even in this room full of people who like to geek out on infrastructure, virtually none of us got up in the morning wondering how and whether we could get a glass of clean, safe drinking water. It's just there. And the moment you can't take it for granted is the moment that you lose a degree of freedom because you got to worry about that, as has happened in communities that are almost always low-income communities and almost always communities of color. So this is a question of justice. And by making more dollars available to conduct the kinds of upgrades on everything from lead service pipes to overall deteriorating infrastructure at a municipal level, we cannot expect low-income communities to foot the bill themselves. Remember, the water bill is just about the least progressive way of getting revenue for anything, because it's the last thing that the poorest person will stop paying, even after cable and even after electricity. And I've seen this. You know, governing a city where the poverty rate was, when I took office, not that far from 30%. The number, we set up 311, it was my big campaign promise. We're going to create a 311 system. It was a no-brainer, right, when you're running for mayor, if your city doesn't have one, that's going to bring all your city services together. And I was wondering, what would the top call be? What would be the top thing once we had that system up and running, kept the campaign promise, created a way to gather all the data of everything somebody's calling about, from a dead possum in the alley to wondering what day their trash pickup is. And by far, the biggest thing people were calling about was they were afraid their water was going to get shut off because they were always this close. And so when we talk about upgrading water infrastructure, we talk about an assist for that, we're talking about something that will disproportionately benefit the most vulnerable Americans. And that's all the more reasons we got to act and get it done.
You know, In that vein, some people think affordable housing ought to be considered infrastructure. Would you spend infrastructure funds on affordable housing?
So in terms of our plans, we fund it in a separate plan, but they're undeniably integrated. Look, the way we did, not just the fact that we need to build, my plan calls for about 2 million more affordable housing units to be built and commits about $700 billion to making sure that we build, $430 billion to making sure we have 7 million more families getting access to affordable housing, including those 2 million units. But also the way they're built. How does it work? How are they laid out? Are we encouraging cities to build in sustainable models? Are we giving communities the tools to do that in an equitable way? And when more housing is built, are we making sure that we're taking steps so that families that got redlined into certain neighborhoods aren't liable to be gentrified right back out of them the moment that they become more valuable on the market? That's going to take intention and our housing vision, and we're actually releasing more this weekend on our housing plan, knowing how the crisis of homelessness is impacting, especially in the West, but across the country. That's also an opportunity through the injection of federal funds to get some economies of scale to pioneer new technologies and new means for sustainability.
We've got time for one last question.
All right. Paul Johnson from Orlando asks, he says, some states and localities have in fact been proactively investing in infrastructure, schools, roads, parks, through local funding measures and fuel tax, sales tax, raising their own revenue. How would you address the issue of fairness in federal funding between states and cities which have worked to improve their areas, their infrastructure, against those who just seek federal funding for it?
Yeah, so I view this as a both and that's why the matching model is so important, making sure that federal dollars are matched with some local resource to expand what could be done by local or state authorities acting on their own. You know, we should be encouraging communities, as many have, to take the courageous step sometimes of voting to tax themselves to create something newer and better. But that should be over the floor. And the floor, federally established, should be that no American should live without access to the basics of transportation and water and safety that is at stake in all of the infrastructure choices that we make. And by the way, the other reason that I think there's a lot of value to greater federal involvement, even when it's as a match to local work, is that it creates an opportunity to raise the standards of labor being involved. Among the many, many reasons why it is disturbing to me that this administration has claimed to be a friend to working people is the fact that they are using things like the shell game of state funding pass-throughs to get around Davis-Bacon and other basic wage and labor standards that we expect as a country will be upheld. The more we have a partnership, the more we can make sure that state and local funds, as they are applied, do it in a way that matches the federal expectations that, once again, on the labor side, as well as on the outcome side, amount to a floor and not a ceiling.
So, Mayor Pete, I will say that when we solicited questions from the United for Infrastructure Coalition, we got more questions about water than anything else. So you are in tune with the organizing committee here.
It's good to hear.
And we want to say thank you very much for coming by. We appreciate it.
Thanks for the chance to be here. Appreciate it.
Great to see you. So that is it for us. I want to say again, thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the C-SPAN audience for being with us. And I hope we have shed some light and maybe excited a few more questions about infrastructure as the campaign goes on. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.